And Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Inshallah, we're going to be continuing our tafsir. And certainly, we are still right here on this ayah. But of course, alhamdulillah, we're right now, I think we were supposed to be having like 32 different subcategories that al-Qurtubi was mentioning. So we're right now 25. Good job. All right, let's continue. So we left off talking about, of course, when it was talking about وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. We really left off at this piece of it in where when we're speaking about wearing socks, what is the ruling on wearing socks? Do they have to be having this padding at the bottom? How do we basically do, and what is the time frame for that wiping on, at least the khuf? We went in details in that regard. So inshallah, we're going to continue this piece of it. So they had differences of opinions. Let's look at right there. What if, all right, the person took off their khuf, all right, even though they had actually already, number one, they wore it on tahara, and number two, they basically already started wiping on it. So in other words, they did their wudhu, they wore their khuf, they already prayed two prayers with it. All right, we're just going to put out a hypothetical situation right there. And then they wiped on it. And then they wanted to enter the masjid. But for some weird reason, they just felt all of a sudden that their toes are itching. So they decided to take it off. They didn't even pray yet for, let's say, Salat al-Asr. Let's see what happens. All right. There are three differences of opinions in that regard. The first one, that they basically have to wash their feet and continue with their wudu. Sorry about that. So the first one basically said that they would have to wash their feet. So let's say they made their wudu when they wiped their feet. Now, well, you're going to have to wash your feet. That's the first opinion. That was the opinion of Imam Malik and al-Layth. And look at the Layth, just on a side, al-Layth ibn Sa'd, okay? We talked about him before, the scholar that lived in Egypt and actually had the ilm even surpassing even Imam Malik. We mentioned that one. The word Layth actually is another name for lion, for those that love names and know what those names mean. Okay, so وكذلك قال الشافعي وأبو حنيفة وأصحابهما. So this opinion that they would have to rewash their feet. It's not only by Imam Malik, but that's also the Shafi'i and even Abu Hanifa. But you want to keep in mind, when you say ashabuhuma, this is not talking about friends. This is actually talking about those that adhered to the school of Abu Hanifa or the Hanafi school. But that's the same thing that was narrated, or at least that was mentioned upon al-Awza'i. Remember, al-Awza'i is a scholar from Lebanon in Nakhai, and let's see, right there. Let's go for the second opinion. The second opinion, they kind of said something really similar. But here, of course, that you would wash your feet, and if the person had basically done wudu already, in other words, this opinion right here kind of goes within the same pattern in where you would have to redo your wudu. Okay, istanif al-wudu, actually redo your wudu. And let's see, for the third opinion, this one's really rather interesting. ليس عليه شيء ويصلي كما هو. يا سلام. That there's nothing that the person has to do. In other words, let's say they made their wudu, they made their masah, but then they took off their khuf and wanted to enter the masjid because their feet were itching, or they didn't want to go inside with the khuf. That the third opinion is that they don't have to do anything in terms of upgrading their wudu, let's say it that way. Let's like that word, upgrading their wudu, and that they just basically could just go pray, even though they took off their khuf. So that's an opinion, Ibn Abi Layla. Inshallah, we'll talk about Ibn Abi Layla. He's a very important scholar. Al-Hasan al-Basri. We could talk about a little bit about Al-Hasan al-Basri. Al-Hasan al-Basri His nanny was actually Salama. His mom would go off to work, and Hassan al-Basri would basically be considered, of course, this baby at the time, but Hassan al-Basri, really important to talk about Hassan al-Basri because he is probably considered the most important figure in speaking about, I guess, tazkiya, and he was known for being a very, I don't want to say astic to mean, kind of like a Sufi, but to mean a very spiritual person. And the word that they used to do was zuhd, zahid. So is zuhd and zahid was, yes, it's translated into English as an astic, but I guess the word astic kind of gives a different connotation, but is zuhd is not necessarily to mean that the person is poor, although many would confuse that, but a zuhd is really a person where they're connecting their heart to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And even it might be a person that is probably a millionaire, but they're using that money for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not to increase in dunya. Al-Hasan al-Basri, he died 110 Hijriya. He was born 21 Hijriya. So that's 10 years after the Prophet ﷺ, and he was therefore a tabi'i. Why was he a tabi'i? Well, he was a tabi'i because simply he didn't make it to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. All right, so 21-year Hijriya is when he was born, and the Prophet ﷺ died 11-year Hijriya. And of course, his mother, the reason why Salama was basically acting as his nanny was basically because his mother was Salama's personal maid slash slave. So his mother was basically busy with other things, and then Salama would be the one to basically take care of him, and believe it or not, sometimes she would even nurse him. So that was amazing, really. All right, let's continue. The other part, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i as well. All right, so this is, and of course, this opinion, I believe, was also mentioned by Ibn Uthaymeen, if I'm not mistaken. All right, let's go for another, here's matter number 26. وَإِن كُنتُمْ جُنُبًا فَطَّهَّرُوا. So here we go. And now we're going farther. إِن كُنتُمْ جُنُبًا فَطَّهَّرُوا. In where if you are in a state of janaba. So remember, the state of janaba, it is basically if the person, male or female, reaches the climax of their sexual desire. So whether that was a result of a wet dream, whether that was a result of masturbation, or whether that was a result of intimacy, basically that takes the person into the state of janaba, and therefore major impurity, and they basically have to take a shower. So the word fattaharu, even though we did actually speak about that in details, I'm just going to go over it really quick. So wattaharu, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you could see the word tahura, and the word tahura and tahara. It basically means, it's the root, basically means to cleanse, to purify, to remove the contamination. All right. But when you look at this as a technical term and not necessarily a word that we would take literally, so you could see what taharu. I want to say a couple things, and where same thing when there was the similar word, ولا تقربوهن حتى يطهرن, in where the same word and the same root was actually mentioned when يسألونك عن المحيض قل هو أذى فاعتزلوا النساء في المحيض ولا تقربوهن حتى يطهرن. Same word that was actually used in Surah al-Baqarah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and they ask you about the menstrual bleeding, or at least menstruation, and tell them that it's a contamination and that they should not approach their wives until the word is hatta yathurn. Now, here's one thing. The word wattaharu and yathurn, Scholars actually had differences of opinion. So if it's a woman that basically had her period and say her husband wanted to be intimate with her, does she have to take a shower or not before she's basically intimate with her husband, or is an istinja or washing the private part enough? That's one thing, is that scholars had differences of opinions on whether, no, she's commanded to take a shower and that her husband cannot approach, at least in intimacy, and it's not enough to wash the private area, but she actually has to take a shower. That's the first opinion. The second opinion is that no, yathurn is to basically here indicate that her cycle, in other words, she's not spotting anymore, her cycle basically ended. Now, here you could see وَطَهَّرُوا, although the same root, the same verb, but a slightly different conjugation. That conjugation difference, remember in Lugha Arabiya, we would say the general rule in Lugha Arabiya is simply, let's see, الزيادة, let's write it down. الزيادة في المباني زيادة في المعاني. This is something that we said before. Any increase on the actual conjugation of a verb is basically giving me an increase in meaning. So in Lugha Arabiya, you cannot just ignore these little tiny little things or الحركات, الشدة, or whether it's an increase in any of to the actual verb, then in that situation, to disregard it is to actually disregard a meaning that was already an additive, let's say it that way, onto the actual root. So what the haru, you could see that this shadda right there, going and following along with the default ruling that we just mentioned, is basically here an imperative. So this is what the haru, it's an imperative verb telling us that it's an order that they have to do a complete body wash. Now that's why, look at this one. This one's really rather interesting. Umar ibn al-Khattab and Ibn Mas'ud, they actually considered that you cannot do tayammum at all if you're in a state of janaba, but instead you're actually supposed to not pray until you find the water. Well, hold on, that's not the final statement. Majority of the scholars, when you say jumhur min an-nas, this is not talking about, hey, we're having these audience and we're having this conversation, but this is actually talking about majority of the scholars here. And they said, well, what this means, what taharu, is that this is simply for the person that even might have some water, but this is when they don't have enough water, all right? And this is why it said أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ. How did they get there? So they got there in where they said إِن كُنتُمْ جُنُبًا فَطَهَّرُوا. They said, well, this right here actually continues the sentence. So when you look at وَإِن كُنتُمْ جُنُبًا فَطَهَّرُوا, and then it went into, okay, إن كنتم مرضى, and إن كنتم على سفر, and إن كنتم ممن جاء من الغائط, or etc. Or if or لامستم النساء. So basically, this ayah, according to the scholars that said that no, there is an objection, and therefore فَطَهَّرُوا right there in where you can do tayammum, even if you had touched women, which is a metaphor in order to basically say if an intimacy had actually happened or any basically sexual climax had happened. So let's say, and that's why they said what is actually intended here in where lamastum nisa, in where it is basically speaking about not la masa to mean touching, but this is a metaphor to mean al-jima'. Al-jima' actually means in intercourse. All right, so right there, and it was mentioned. I want you to look at this one. Remember before we said Umar ibn al-Khattab and Ibn Mas'ud, they basically said that tayammum cannot be an alternative to basically lacking water. In other words, during the state of janaba? Well, here's the thing. Here he then said, وَقَدْ صَحَّ عَنْ عُمَرْ وابن مسعود أنهما رجعا إلى ما عليه الناس. I want you to focus on this one. Said it was actually mentioned in authentic narrations upon Umar ibn al-Khattab and Ibn Mas'ud, even though we just earlier said that they had said that you cannot do tayammum, but you could see that that was their opinion before, and it isn't until it happened later that they realized that there was evidence to support the other opinion, and that a person in a state of janaba can also do tayammum when the water is, whether it's scarce or whether water is not there. I'll be back in just a second. All right, back, my friends. So what we get out of this is that it can happen that you could sometimes see that a certain narration was actually mentioned, and then later on, you would see other narrations contradicting the first narration. So it's really important to, I guess, see and have that ilm before you get into this myopic, myopic I guess, vision or understanding, and where you're not realizing that there's actually another narration even before you would say contradictory. But it's important to understand that in the beginning, they might have thought the fatwa, or they might have not had at least information in regards to something that the Prophet ﷺ might have taught. Let's see. The hadith that is probably the most important hadith in that regards. So we're talking about if a person goes in a state of janaba, and are they, we just mentioned what that meant, so let's call it post-sexual. Let's call it that way, right? Impurity. Let's do it that way. All right, so this is the most important hadith. Imran ibn Husayn, he basically said that the Prophet ﷺ, a man comes to him, and this man was, well, at least the Prophet ﷺ saw a man that was ostracizing everyone. So he was basically just sitting in a corner. This man is not even praying with everyone else. The Prophet ﷺ then calls him and basically, yeah, Fulan. Fulan is basically not the name, so this is anonymous right there. And he asked him, why did you just pray with everyone else? And the man said, O Prophet of Allah, I basically am in a state of janaba and I don't have water to get into a shower, basically. So the Prophet ﷺ said, عليك بالصعيد فإنه يكفيك. It's enough to use a side. A side is basically soil or anything that goes on earth. We talked about that before. So whether it's sand, soil, or even rocks. And he said, and that should suffice. You could see this hadith is in al-Bukhari. Let's see where else. You could see that this hadith is in Bukhari, even Muslim, and even, let's look at it right there, and even in Musnad Ahmad. So this hadith, if you got Bukhari and Muslim, that's actually muttafaqun alayh, right on the spot. So that hadith basically is considered perhaps the most important hadith in that regards, and where, yes, even if you're in a state of janaba, there wasn't enough time. Let's give an example, maybe a hypothetical situation. Let's just assume that you were in Afghanistan, okay? Let's put you somewhere else, all right? Or maybe in the Middle East. And you, of course, in some countries, they don't have what you're privileged to have, which is a water heater. Okay, in some countries, they're not privileged to have that. In order to basically do a complete shower, they would really have to heat it up on the stove and then basically mix it with cold water. Basically, it's going to take some time. All right, but let's say you wanted to wake up for Fajr. This person was in a state of janaba, but in order to take a shower, it would basically mean that they would have to heat the water. because if they were to use cold water, they're definitely going to get sick. So in that situation, well, they only have 3 minutes left until sunrise. Should they do tayammum or should they not do tayammum? Right? That's the differences of opinions right there. In where, okay, if they're going to do if they're not going to do tayammum, and just when the water heats up, it's probably going to need like 15 minutes. And by 15 minutes, it's going to be way after sunrise. But the person does have water. It's just that the water is not hot enough. So in that situation, you could say that this person, according to these scholars, can actually make tayammum. Okay, can make tayammum. Other scholars regarded that no, work on heating the water, and basically when the water gets heated, basically right there, go and do your ghusl and then do your salah. But you could say this is considered a preponderant ruling, in where based on this hadith, of course, the Prophet ﷺ could have actually told him, well, go, take a shower, come back, and whenever you would take a shower, you would come back. But the Prophet ﷺ basically said, عليك بالصيد فإنه يكفيك. So this hadith is basically to answer all of that, in where it's enough to do tayammum. And we did it last time. We showed you the video last time of that scholar that was basically hitting on the soil with, or well, he was doing it on his desk, but that's in order to tell you, that's how you would do it if there was soil there. And then you would let go of all that soil off your hand. It doesn't have to be completely, because you're really just wanting that dust of it. You wipe your face once and then you basically just wipe your hands. Well, that's not only when you don't have water, but that's also the case. Let's just give another hypothetical, I guess, another example right there. Let's just say that this person basically is supposed to be taking a shower. In other words, they're in a state of janaba, but if they were to take multiple showers, they usually get a flu. They don't have to get extremely sick in order for us to say use tayammum, but they know that tayammum would basically be an alternative. And of course, they don't want to use the shower and shower multiple times because, with their experience, it doesn't have to be a doctor's diagnose. Even if it's their own experience, they had noticed and realized every time they would take multiple showers throughout the night, and they had already taken two, for example, one when they got back from work, and the second one was when they were intimate with their spouse. And then right now, let's say that they went into, I guess, another need for perhaps they were intimate again. Let's just assume, okay? And in that situation, do they, especially if they're, newlywed, all right, and they're wondering, hey, basically got sick before, and every single time take more than one shower, basically get sick. So in that situation, we'll say, just make tayammum for the second time or the third time or fourth time or whatever time that if you had exceeded the limit that you would get sick. All right, you don't necessarily need a doctor's prescription. It's enough to actually know through your experience that if you do multiple showers, that you're going to get sick. So this is just to end it right there. وإن كنتم مرضى أو على سفر أو جاء أحد منكم من الغائط. And even though, we talked about this before, but really quick, you know what? I'm going to skip this one because we talked about it before. And all right, let's go for 28. أو لامستم النساء, and if you touch women. And of course, we mentioned that this is not to touch, meaning, yeah, we kind of touch hands or in any way, but this is actually here, أو لامستم النساء. So Abu Ubaid, he basically said, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said that whether it is that foreplay or kissing is actually part of lamastum النساء. In other words, this is anything that is less than actual intercourse. So this right there, and where what he was trying to say, anywhere you could do tayammum, whether as a result of, what should I keep in mind? We mentioned before the Hanafis, they basically said, أو لمستم النساء, they said that this is a metaphor to mean intercourse. For the Malikis and Hanbalis, they said لمستم النساء would only be a wudu breaker, or let's call it a ritual impurity, only if an actual discharge happens. So they basically looked at it at the discharge. And we also mentioned that the Shafi'i, on the other hand, they considered even if it's an innocent touch, quote unquote, that still would suffice and basically act as a wudu breaker. Whether this woman was their own mother, or whether that was their sister, or whether that was their wife, or whether that was because you were trying to pay, you tried to give them the quarter, but then I guess, your hand bumped into his hand, you didn't mean to shake hands, etc. But that's what happened. According to the Shafi'i, nope, that's a wudu breaker right on the spot. We did go in details in that regard, so I'm not going to go into all of that. And you could see Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said, al-lamsu wal-massu wal-ghashayan al-jima. So basically, for Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he said the word la ma'sa, or even mas, or ghashayan, or even penetration, is all to basically speak about intercourse. But of course, Abdullah Mas'ud considered that was a way of adab. That was a way of adab in where he used a word to basically mean all of that, but it was really referring to the same thing. All right, so I'm just going to go over this other topic, topic 29, فَلَمْ تَجِدُوا مَاءً, and if you don't find water, and of course, in that situation, whether the person knew that there was no water, or whether the person put in some searching efforts at the end of the day, if they don't have water, all right, and or they basically knew that there was no water, or they searched for it at the end of the day, it would basically be considered that it would suffice to do tayammum if they don't find it. And certainly, let's say right there in where, of course, if they could not find water or soil, all right, and they worry that the time is going to go up. Let's just assume that they were at the hospital. Okay, we're going to put in this weird situation. They were at the hospital, but the doctors already told them that they can't use water. And of course, at the hospital, I mean, in order to get the soil, you would basically have to go downstairs, probably, or maybe at the lounge, whatever, and get some soil there. But then, of course, you were bedridden, you couldn't send anybody, and you didn't speak English to tell your nurses to get you a little bit and be nice and get you some soil. Okay, let's just assume I'm putting you this weird case. And this person that is bedridden, nas'alullah al-afwa al-afiyah, they were worried that the time is going to go up. So what should I do now? I've got water, but I'm not allowed to use it. I have this severe illness that I'm not supposed to use water. I can't even use turab. I don't have access to it. And I could see asr time is going up. Let's see the four differences of opinions in that weird case, right? Let's see the first one. They basically said they don't pray and they don't have to do anything. That's the first opinion. Ibn Khuwaizim would basically Iraqi Maliki, he said that they don't do anything. Don't even pray. In other words, and they've got no responsibility. The second opinion, Ibn al-Qasim is basically Abdul Rahman ibn al-Qasim. He's also Maliki. He said, well, he would pray and then redo the prayer. So that's the second opinion. They would pray, redo the prayer, and that's basically what a Shafi'i had said. Let's say the third opinion, they said he would pray and they don't even need to redo the prayer. Let's see the fourth opinion. They don't pray and they don't even make up any prayer. That was really rather strange. And that was what Abu Hanifa had said. Let's see. Let's look at Abu Umar right there, Ibn Abd al-Barr. Remember that that scholar, Hafid al-Maghrib. We even showed you his books and a couple books. He said, I don't know how Ibn Khuwaizimandad, who's basically right there in where he said he doesn't pray and there's nothing that he has to make up. And he said, I don't know how he basically had considered that that is what is authentic in the madhab. Now remember, Ibn Khuwaizimandad is actually Maliki. And he said that's basically contradicting what the majority of the scholars of fiqh had said, and even the majority of the scholars of al-madhab Maliki. So just keep that in mind. And he said, and there is no evidence to support that. So to actually say he doesn't have to pray, there's nothing that he has to do, is really, he said, لا حجة فيه. There's no evidence to support that, to actually tell the person, oh, you don't have to pray, you don't have to worry about it, do nothing. There's nothing to support that opinion. All right, let's see. And of course, he said, وَقَدْ احْتَجَّ الْمُزَنِي. المزني, just on the side, المزني, okay, he was actually a Shafi'i scholar. But here's one thing. His uncle, الطحاوي, he trained him and he really wanted him to be a Hanafi scholar. But then he was really sad that why would he choose such a madhab to him at least. All right, let's see. احتج المزني is Shafi'i, and الكي الطبري, they basically had depended on an evidence in where the evidence of the story of the necklace. Story of the necklace is that when the Prophet's companions, they basically had went in search for the necklace, that they actually prayed without tayamum and without even doing wudhu. And when they told the Prophet of that's when this ayah was revealed, and the Prophet did not reprimand them from doing their prayer with no wudu or even no tayammum. And even though, of course, tayammum was not something that they were familiar with, so in other words, they had prayed with no purity, period. And al-Muzani actually takes that as evidence, and he says they didn't redo their prayer, and therefore this is an evidence that when there is no resource to do purification, and it was hard to get to at least another source to purify. We're speaking about, for example, soil, like the story that we had mentioned. So it was really rather strange right there. Let's see Abu Umar ibn Abd al-Marr. He said, وَلَا ينبغي حمله على المغمى عليه. He said that this isn't supposed to be something that we're going to do like an analogy and consider that we're going to consider those that went through some coma, that they basically do not have to redo their prayer. In fact, salah is obligatory on them as long as they are considered sane. If they're sane, then therefore they're obligated to pray. But once what is blocking them and blocking their ability from performing the prayer, then in that situation, they would make wudu and they would do or tayammum and they would pray. Let's see right there. So what if the person was imprisoned and they weren't able to get, let's call it clean soil? Okay, clean soil, in other words, let's just say that the soil out there was somehow got contaminated because the sewage system got broken or something. All of a sudden, everything just, including the soil, it just, I don't know, just went off from being clean to being really nothing but stinky and full of sewage waters. And in that situation, all right, and Zufar ibn Hudayl, Abu Yusuf, and Muhammad. Now, those are all, so you could say Abu Yusuf, Muhammad, and his name is Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. Abu Yusuf, let me tell you a story about Abu Yusuf. Abu Yusuf, his name is Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, okay? Abu Yusuf, or Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, as a child, his mother would basically send Abu Yusuf or Yaqub ibn Ibrahim to get items from the market. But then Abu Yusuf or Yaqub ibn Ibrahim, he was so interested in overhearing or at least listening to whatever Abu Hanifa was teaching the students. So Abu Yusuf would just stand at the door, forget his mom's items, and just stand there for hours. Then mom would come and search for Yaqub ibn Ibrahim / Abu Yusuf and come with a broom, basically after him. What did I tell you to do? You didn't do what I told you. You're basically a disobedient child, and start spanking him for attending the class and forgetting about the items. So that's when Abu Hanifa, I guess it was happening so frequently that Abu Hanifa realized that Yaqub ibn Ibrahim had so much interest in seeking ilm that he actually hired a maid for Abu Yusuf's mother and let Abu Yusuf actually continue attending the classes until he actually became perhaps the most important or the second most important student / scholar after Muhammad ibn Hasan al-Shaybani. All right, and Zufar ibn al-Hudayl was also, these were actually together. They basically said if a person is imprisoned and basically within the city, they don't pray, even if they found clean soil. Why? Because if the person is anyways imprisoned, so they have an exceptional case, all right? فإنه لا يتيمم عنده في الحضر كما تقدم. Okay, so that's a really strange one. You know, my professors, at least one of them, speaking about mahbus, I think it's worth mentioning here, especially with what is happening in Gaza, where I guess people talking about it had really, I guess, stopped talking about Gaza. You know, I studied my undergrad and my master's in Palestine. One of my professors, maybe I could even show you his picture. And one of his name is Dr. Ibrahim Abu Salim. And I must, admit, Ibrahim Abu Salim. Maybe I could see if I could, let's see. Yeah, this is it. This is him. This is one of my professors, and I think it's fair to say, during our class, he was teaching me some of the fiqh classes, and many times he would get imprisoned. So he would basically start the classes and then get imprisoned. He got imprisoned like over 10, 13 times or so. All right. And every time he would come out of prison, he would start coming to class and start teaching the classes. But then at many times, his classes, he would still be suffering from the PTSD from the torture in prisons. And he would just end up really just crying in class, just remembering what they would go through in prisons and speak about. Now, he lived in complete poverty as a young child, and he even lived as an orphan. And later he was taken as he was, so here's what happened. Let me show you that. Okay. Okay, and maybe, let's see if we could, there you go. You know what happened? Israel actually took 400, look at all these numbers, took 416 or 415, it was 415, and just in one day, all right, just took all of them, and they're mostly professors, they're mostly students of ilm, etc., and basically just piled them up together, put them on the borders of Lebanon, and just threw them there. So he was actually one of these people. Here's Ismail Haniya, and let me see, here's Rantisi, and who else can we actually identify in these pictures? All right, and what is it? Yeah, so basically some of these figures. And of course, they stayed there for almost a whole year. And guess what they did? They actually did their own school. Okay, they did their own school, their own university. They called it Ibn Taymiyyah school, and they even started teaching each other just different fields of sciences. But my professor would always remember what happened there, and during their time, and of course, my professor, at least during his time of staying here at the borders of Lebanon, they had no tents, no nothing. So they started just basically getting whatever they could get from basically this harsh terrain right there and living out in the wilderness. All right. And he would just remember and basically connected himself and managed to do there was no online at the time, but it was like in participation. I think that's what it's called, and basically got his degree from University of Sudan. But anyhow, just wanted to mention that. And he would say, my professor would say often how 18, 20 days that they would be put in a posture, in this posture, in this position where their hands are to their back, tied to their back, and they're standing on their toes, and they're basically like their neck is connected with some kind of a, kind of like they're ready, basically they're getting them ready. If you dare move, you would basically right there, basically get killed, because there's a nuke right around your neck. So you're holding yourself. And he said that we would be standing 18 days, and sometimes, of course, the knot where the rope is tied around their arms, and not necessarily a nuke, but sometimes around around their arms, sometimes around. So it's really in a torture position. And many times he would say that they would go in a state of Geneva, or sometimes they would even, use the bathroom on themselves. They're all just full of nothing but contaminants all around, and their body even gets a severe rash, all of that. And it's just, every time he would remember it, and he would just go into, I guess, a moment of just crying because of the situations that, I guess, too hard for him to explain what really happens and what really happened um, within these areas of torture that Israel had actually set up. So just to mention that one. And there is, let's see, one of those, he actually, for those that are interested, I think it was, let me see, his name was Ghassan Hermes. He actually wrote a book. Let's see, well, this is him. This is Ghassan Hermes. This is him. He's the author for one of the books. And let me see, in the book, in where he does talk about, here we go, this is it. So basically this book, he does talk about what happened and how the Israeli soldiers were actually urinating on them. They were torturing them. They weren't even allowing them to get some water or anything. How they fought like almost 50 and 60 people in one room. There was no bathroom. It was nothing but an empty can of pickles or an empty can of whatever it is, and everybody was just urinating in that, to the point that it started flooding all around, and they were sleeping in that same place. So it was really another type of torture, very similar to the one that you would actually see with Hafez al-Assad, I guess. But I don't know why I mentioned that one. So those are those similar cases where I never imagined during my undergrad that there would be anybody that would be, I guess, imprisoned, and where didn't have water, didn't have access to even soil, and they can't even move because they're all tied up. So what happens in that situation? Though they would do what, or many times they would even strip them naked. So in that situation, what they would do is basically إيماءً يصلوا إيماءً. They would pray ima'an, meaning to basically mimic the postures, mimic the movements of salah. So mimic the movement of salah, whether we're speaking about sujood, ruku', etc. If they can't even mimic it with their own head, let's say it's far too dangerous, then they can mimic it with their own eyelids. And what about the wudu? If they can't even move, let's just assume that they're tied up, tied their hands to their back in that situation. Just pray as is, even if you are not capable of making wudu. So basically, even without your tahara, just basically pray as is. All right. And yeah, just wanted to mention that one. Although, it might be a rare case, but we still have to keep in mind, I guess, those that go through these kind of tortures and these kind of situations where we're seeing right now, at least some people released from the Israeli prisons, and telling us about their experiences there. All right, so let's see here. We've got 30, category 30, فتيمموا صعيدا طيبا. We talked about it before in Hadith Imran ibn Husayn. And let's see right there. 31, okay. الطهور الطهور شطر الإيمان. Okay, so this hadith is narrated by Muslim. What does that mean? So basically the importance of tahara, the importance of purification, in where he said at-tuhur. At-tuhur is basically purity, is half of the faith. In other words, this is in order to teach us that there are certain contaminations on the body that have a direct relationship with how your faith is bonding, of course, within your heart, within your spirit, and certainly within your mind. So when you're looking at الطهور شطر الإيمان, it's basically coming in as it's half of the faith. In other words, you cannot whatsoever disregard the importance of salah without you realizing it will affect your faith. And certainly you will see that with faith itself actually comes purity, in where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, هذا وضوئي ووضوء الأنبياء من قبلي ووضوء خليلي إبراهيم. In where, although it was mentioned, this hadith here indicating that the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned this hadith, but here indicating that it's not authentic. But at the end, we're just going to quote this so we would know at least what it's saying. This is my wudu. This is the wudu that the prophets before me had done, and even the wudu that Ibrahim alayhi salam had done. He said, وَذَلِكَ لَا يَصَحْ, let's say. Okay, let's see. والوضوء أصل في الدين وطهارة المسلمين. And of course, we know that it's a main basis, but that hadith in particular, although is not authentic, but of course we know that in terms of iman and tahara, they are deeply correlated to one another. Okay, let's continue right there. And here Abu Umar ibn Abdul Barr, he basically said that al-Anbiya, certainly they might have actually done wudu, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be doing it in the same way, number one. That's not what Abu Umar is saying, but of course, this is me on a side commenting. But at the end, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically told us that whether we're speaking about food or whether we're speaking about tahara, that it basically is correlated with our faith. And that's why you could see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ, the second that you would want to attempt to go to prayer. Let's continue right there. مَا يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ لِيَجْعَلَ عَلَيْكُم مِّنْ حَرَجٍ وَلَكِنْ يُرِيدُ لِيُطَهِّرَكُمْ تَطْهِيرًا. We mentioned that one. So we're just going to go over right here. Let's see. ثاني والثلاثون, we talked about this, and now we're jumping on to the following ayah. Let's see right there. واذكروا نعمة الله عليكم وميثاقه الذي واثقكم به إذ قلتم سمعنا وأطعنا واتقوا الله إن الله عليم بذات الصدور. And remember the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had blessed you with. Let's look into this ayah right there in where there is a mithaq. What is a mithaq? The word mithaq, mithaqahu, the word mithaq actually means the convent, the bond, and certainly, well, what is the bond? Well, the bond was actually supposed to be related to this ayah, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ بَنِي آدَمَ مِنْ ظُهُورِهِمْ. Let's actually go to that ayah, right? Even though it's not actually mentioned right here, we're going to get that for you. وَإِذْ, so you could see it. I know that many of you would like to actually see it. وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ, okay, min bani adam min zuhurihim. Here we go. I'm gonna go there right there, and hopefully, here we go. And here we go. All right. وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ مِنْ بَنِي آدَمَ مِنْ ظُهُورِهِمْ وَأَشْهَدَهُمْ عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ. Here we go. Let's go like this. All right. وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ مِنْ بَنِي آدَمَ مِنْ ظُهُورِهِمْ. When your Lord Almighty had taken from the backs of Adam and from the backs of Adam his own offspring, and he made them witnesses upon themselves. Am I not your Lord? And they said, verily you are. And on that day, you would say, that is on the day of standing, or the day of Yawm al-Qiyamah, or the judgment day, you would say, Inna kunna an hadha ghafilin. They would say, or trying to justify themselves, that, well, we were pacified away from this. In other words, they were basically trying to say, well, it's not our fault. We were just really busy. Something just took away our focus off of it. And that's why it's really important to remember that focus. Remember the class that we were talking about in Aqidah, in where we said there are a number of different things, and we made an example of the router, in where you've got different lights on your router, and sometimes, of course, we're talking about the body, we're talking about the mind, we're talking about the soul, we're talking about the heart. All of those need to be turned on in order to make a complete connection with the Lord Almighty. Well, that's the same thing in where أن تقولوا إنا كنا عن هذا غافلين. Here we go. So what they were really saying, that while there was something basically that was keeping their ability to get a strong connection was not there. Why? Because they were غافلين. They were living in a state of ghafla. They were living in a state where they basically lost their focus, and then they basically lost the connection to stay within this mithaq, to stay within il-mithaq, to stay within, of course, the bond, the connection. All right, what is it? الذي واثقكم به إذ قلتم سمعنا وأطعنا. So there was actually, there was a convent, there was something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put it within your instinct, but of course, different, let's say, contaminators, and let's say different, I guess, obstructions that obstructed the relationship between you and also the instinct that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created within you. So when we're speaking about instinct, we're talking about whether mind instinct, body instinct, or even heart instinct, and certainly also the spiritual instinct. When we say, now keep this one in mind, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually said that لا تبديل لخلق الله. There's no change in the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, you're the same humans that were, I don't know, 50,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, etc. You're the exact same humans. So nothing really changed. All right. Perhaps certain changes, but that does not really affect the core of at least your, let's say, the Homo sapien part of you, or at least the human part of you. You're still the same person, or at least the same human beings. Okay. Now, when we see right there, and where fitra, so the fitra of the body, for example, where we would see the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned in terms of fitra that there are khamsun min sunan al-fitra, so 5 that are part of the methods of hygiene for are fitra. So in other words, it's part of you, and you cannot necessarily dismiss that fitra, because it basically is correlated, and it is intertwined with what affects your vision, what affects your body, your heart, mind, etc. Now, here's one thing. The Prophet ﷺ mentioned khamsun min sunan al-fitra and talked about the different ways to basically preserve the hygiene in the body. Now, here's one thing, is that this isn't talking about just the hygiene, but the Prophet ﷺ also talked about that certain things are part of fitra, in where he also had mentioned that there's part of fitra in where not only hygiene, but part of fitra in where to engage in certain things. So we could see that the Quran, you know what's going on? Noura, can you do me a favor? There's somebody in one of the Gems of Light group. You got to block these people. Somebody called Faith. I think they're causing a mess in the group. So
okay, I'll get on it.
Yeah. Anyhow, so sorry about that. So when we're speaking about the fitra, we could also see the ayat in where, for example, talked about Lut, in where that action, that sodomy, that action was against al-fitra, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala indicated that there was no nation that basically committed what they had committed. In other words, even when we're speaking about the structure of human nature, structure of behavior, all of that, it's basically part of what will affect the person's mind, the person's behavior is correlated with what actually goes on in their heart. So just putting it just mentioning that piece of it. And of course, we're not just talking about the body, but we're speaking about other types of sunan al-fitra. All right, let's see. The other, some of the scholars actually said that this ayah is not necessarily relating to وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ بَنِي آدَمَ ظُهُورِهِمْ, and said that this is actually related to the Yahud, in where they were asked to preserve what was in the Torah and the different prophecies that were mentioned in the Torah. And therefore, this ayah was basically telling the Yahud, remember the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed you with, in where He took it upon you that you would abide by the scripture of the Lord Almighty, and you had said that you were going to obey, and that you were hearing the words of the Lord Almighty. So therefore, remember the prophecy and follow the prophecy that the Prophet ﷺ is basically the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this was I guess one interpretation. Just wanted to mention that one. But in the end, let's just look at the word. وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ, and remember the blessings of the Lord Almighty upon you, and the convent that He had taken upon you, when you had said, we had heard and we had obeyed, and have fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and your Lord Almighty, verily your Lord Almighty is all-knowing, and all-knowing of what goes on in the chest. So just keep that right there, in where within the context you could see that the wording, or at least the wording itself, can be really directed at the Yahud and can also be directed at the Muslims. We want to keep in mind that al-ibra bi'umum al-lafzi la bikhusus al-sabab. Let's actually write it right there again, even though we mentioned this one before, but we're going to write it again. Al-ibra, maybe I'm just going to put it right there. Al-ibra, oops, where'd it go? It was supposed to be there. Al-ibra, العبرة بعموم اللفظ لا بخصوص السبب. So, what does that mean? We mentioned this before, in where what really matters And what the theme that we would be considerate over is really in the generalizing and the generalized statement right there, and not necessarily in the particularizing incident that this ayah was really referring to. So right there, whether it's talking to the Yahud or whether it's talking to us as Muslims, at the end of the day, it's really supposed to be that we're supposed to be keeping the and keeping the bond, and certainly remembering, number one, وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ, remember the good things, remember the blessings. But this blessing is basically the blessing in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had put it upon you, put it as part of your instinct, that you would connect with the Lord Almighty. In other words, in order to connect yourself with yourself, connect yourself with yourself, how does that even happen? Well, you connect yourself, that's your inner will, with yourself, because your inner will is one side of you, but then yourself is actually consistent of your body, your mind. So body, mind, heart, and soul. So when you're connecting yourself with yourself, you're basically bringing this bond together. And because the second that any of these sides go in an opposition to one another, that's when you're going to go in a state of dhanka. That's when you're going to find yourself that you're confusing everything, and you're going to find yourself living in some form of confusion, some form of mental health issues, some form of depression, some form of anxiety, basically because the body was not created for each to work in a different way, but you all have to work towards one direction. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna Allah alimun bidhat as-sudur. What is a sadr? There's a difference between a sadr, al-fu'ad, and al-qalb. الصدر, الفؤاد, and القلب. الصدر is wider. الصدر is chest. Sadr is usually what is appearing in the middle of something. It's the chest. القلب is the core. القلب is the core. الفؤاد is basically the deepest thing in the core. القلب is the core, and القلب is the heart. Al-fu'ad is the deepest thing. So think of, if I were to basically put it in an anatomy structure, if I'm to talk about as-sadr, this is to talk about the chest area, okay? So basically the chest area, your front. Al-qalb is basically the heart. Al-fu'ad is basically the receptors in the heart. Okay, now this is extremely important to understand, because when he says Inna Allah alimun bidhat as-sudur, this is basically telling you when, in one way, to help with curing what is happening in the chest, what is happening in your heart, what is happening within the side of you. One way to give that treatment is basically to rethink and redirect your vision from looking at the negative things to actually look at the ni'mah. وَاذْكُرُوا ni'mah. Remember the ni'mah. Remember the blessings. I want you to redirect your focus. That's how you would redirect your heart. That's how you would redirect your chest. That's how you would redirect your receptors. It's what you would actually say. Well, here's one thing. When you say وَاذْكُرُوا ni'mah, does that mean that I actually have to say it? I've got children. I've got a good health. I've got a job. I've got this. Does that mean that I'm supposed to be saying it literally? Or is that to mean, is dhikra to mean to remember in my mind? It can actually be both. What's the evidence? Well, the evidence, when you look at, first of all, the word dhakara, the word dhakara literally means, one, to remember. Dhakara could also mean to mention and utter, and dhakara could also mean to repeat consistently. Okay. Now, when you look at that, all of these are actually in there. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says here in an imperative verb, وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ, it can mean to remember. It can mean to mention, because even when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالضُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى مَا وَدَّعَكَ رَبُّكَ وَمَا قَلَى مَا وَدَّعَكَ رَبُّكَ وَمَا قَلَى وَلَلْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنَ الْأُولَى وَلَسَوْفَ يُعْطِيكَ رَبُّكَ فَتَرْضَى. All right, what is it? What did we just say? In where? أما بنعمة ربك فحدث. What ayah is that? Anyhow, so when you look at أما بنعمة ربك فحدث, mention the different ni'am, not necessarily to people and bring all the envy upon yourself, but mention the ni'am. Part of mentioning the ni'am is you recognizing it. It's not for others to recognize it. It's for you to recognize it. It's for you to embrace it. Because the ni'mah, you're the first one that needs to see it. You have to recognize it in order to feel it, in order to also embrace that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given you these provisions. So وَاذْكُرُوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْكُمْ. And remember the blessings of the Lord Almighty. وَمِيثَاقَهُ الَّذِي وَاثَقَكُمْ بِهِ. So let's actually do some drawing right here. So this is the first one. How do I actually change? How do I change what is in that as-sudur? How do I change what's inside my chest? Number one, I want you to remember the good things. Change the vision. That's what's going to take you into recognizing your Lord Almighty. Number two, مِيثَاقَكُمُ الَّذِي وَاثَقَكُمْ بِهِ. Taking that moment, taking that moment to actually embrace al-mithaq, the convent, the principles of the Lord Almighty. So it's not enough to just tell yourself kind of like I don't know, like a yoga class, and start telling yourself that you're living a good life, and keep on repeating that. All right, this is not a yoga class, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, you can't just tell yourself that you're living in lots of blessings, but you actually have to put and consider, of course, living the principles of the Lord Almighty. It's not enough to just tell yourself. You have to basically live the words and the principles of the Lord Almighty. Let's see. And of course, wattaqullah. That's the other part. Now, they were saying, سَمِعْنَا وَأَطَعْنَا. In other words, it's actually part right there. إِذْ قُلْتُمْ سَمِعْنَا وَأَطَعْنَا. We said, we heard and we obeyed. But what does it mean to have taqwa? What it means to have taqwa is to listen to the actual words, to learn your deen, and that's what's going to basically pave the way to really knowing what it means to have ta'ah. Let's do it again. Let me clarify that one. And of course, here's wattaqullah. What does it mean to have taqwa? It's basically to know the words, to learn the words, to hear the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what's going to help you recognize how to obey the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because if you don't have the ilm, and ilm, it's not an issue of somehow having it processed in your brains, but you actually have to hear al-wahi. You have to hear al-wahi. And that's what brings in taqwa. What brings in taqwa is basically what brings in that relationship between your vision, your action, here it is, your action, and certainly that commitment and the consistency in how you would basically bring in taqwa. That's what brings in taqwa. Let's do it again. Your vision, your action, your commitment and consistency, that's what keeps taqwa in your heart, and you will see that it's going to have an effect on you and even on your life, and even have an effect on how you're living your deen itself. So let's continue right there. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. So how do I live this faith? Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu kunu qawwamina lillah. Let's look at this one. Oh, you who believe. Well, wait a minute. So now you're telling me, oh, you who believe again. Yes, ma'am. We're going to tell you, oh, you who believe again. Let's see. right there. Let's count how many, oh, you who believe, just from Surah Al-Ma'idah, just from the beginning. Let's see, 1, 2, right? Those are 2, and all right, so 3, 4 are ready. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله. B, the word is قوامين. What is القوام? القوام actually has a couple meanings. The word قوام actually comes from the root قام. Let's actually write that down. All right, it actually comes from the root قام. Okay, let's write it down. The word قام. Now, the word قام actually means to stand, but this isn't necessarily speaking about anybody standing right here. But of course, in Lugha Arabiya, remember, if you were to have a verb and even the conjugation of that verb, the new structure is going to still be traced back to the actual root. So here, when you say كونوا قوامين لله, in where you're standing, and of course in Lugha Arabiya, we mentioned الزيادة في المباني زيادة في المعاني. You've got the shadda right there, you've got the right there, in where, how do I understand within all of this? قوامين لله, in where you're standing, you're supporting, you're preserving, you're learning, you're taking all of that, and that's where you remember الرجال قوامون على النساء. It's exactly the same thing, exactly the same word, in where it's to preserve, it's to keep, it's to hold strong, it's to be consistent, it's to have conviction, and all of that is قوامين, but who? For the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whether you're standing in recognizing justice, or whether it's in enduring the different, let's say the different hardships and having patience, or whether, let's write that down. We did it in the class, in the other class. Let's do it right here. All right, it's basically recognizing justice. It's basically enduring the patience. It's basically going through that satisfaction, and certainly the courage right there. All of that is basically part of what actually makes a person qawwam lillah. The justice, they're basically standing up based on the terms of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not based on their own terms. Number 2, the patience, because you cannot be qawwam if you're not putting in the struggle, you're not enduring the pain, you're not recognizing that there is going to be some form of effort being put in. If you're just going to live within your comfort zone, you're never going to get anywhere. And the third one, which is iffa, satisfaction, qawwam lillah, where despite all the different, perhaps invitations to let go of the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they're actually living, even if it means to the minimum, and in order to stay strong. قوامين لله also means to be in leadership. That's why الرجال قوامون على النساء, they're basically in places of leadership, they're places of authority, places of protection, places of security. That's what brings in courage. There we go. That's what brings in courage. So, يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله, in where you're standing with justice, you're standing with patience, you're standing with all the satisfaction, even if it's to the minimum, and you're standing with all your courage. All right, شهداء بالقسط, in where you would, whether you're right there, this A is basically speaking about those that are witnessing. So you're going to stand to witness the truth and not engage in any forgery. And of course, on what? On qist. What is al-qist? Qist is basically justice. Here we go. It's right there. Okay. Al-qist is basically justice. So what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asking us to do? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically asking us right there to stand, to be people of faith. And you can't be people of faith unless you basically are mu'min, because that's your center. So that's recognizing justice right there. قوامين لله, you're going to be enduring patience right there. And شهداء بالقسط takes you back to justice again and again. ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا. What is ولا يجرمنكم? يجرمنكم, in other words, don't necessarily be pressured Look at the word يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ. And you know the word يَجْرِمَنَّكُم, the word جَرَمَ is the root in where jarama actually means to put, well, jarama actually means to commit something, all right? So here, when you're looking at يَجْرِمَنَّكُم, in where others are putting effort, an effort, others are pressuring you to let go of your at least commitment to justice or commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and don't let the pressures, don't let all those that are trying to take away your focus. And the word shana'an, look at the word shana'an. Shana'an, of course, the hatred, the friction between you and someone take you away from justice. In other words, you're going to be committed to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if that was against your, let's say, preference or against your perhaps interest. You're still supposed to be committed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if that was in witness, even if that you're witnessing and against something that is considered against something that is probably considered maybe conflicting with your interest, or perhaps right there you wanted to be a witness on something, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, do not be in forgery or in false witnessing, whether that was against someone that you had some form of shana'an, some form of anger, some form of friction with that person. In other words, any type of principle, you're going to be abiding by the principle, even if it basically had went against your comfort zone. اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى. Then act in complete adl, in complete justice, for that is closer to piety. So what is this ayah taking us again into? It's telling us, well, I want you to be a mu'min. Right there, this is what a mu'min would do. And number two, you're taking in the time to be patient, qawwameen, and you're going to be consistent with it. And even if that basically had collided or at least went against your own interest, that doesn't mean you would give yourself the justification because it basically went across and against your own interest. Doesn't mean that you would change the truth. اعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى. And be a person of adl, be a person of justice that's near to taqwa. Wattaqullah. Let's see how many times it mentioned taqwa, right? Let's see. So here we go. We've got right there aqrabu lit-taqwa, that is near to taqwa. And then it says wattaqullah, and have taqwa. Inna Allah khabirum bima ta'malun. For the Lord Almighty is all-knowing of what you do. So 2 times it was, and right there telling us taqwa again. Did it? You can see right there. So connecting us with taqwa 2 times in this ayah. Inna Allah khabirum bima ta'malun. For the Lord Almighty is all-knowing of all that you would do. What is this supposed to mean? Let's put it within the context right there. We're going to wipe that right there. What is that supposed to mean? In where? Number 1, what actually happens in the chest has a direct relationship with how you relate with yourself, how and what you relate with the world around you. That's basically what happens on in the chest. But what actually affects your behavior is, number 1, is you recognizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware and all-knowing of what you do. So therefore, in order to give treatment to your behavior, it's basically recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, recognizing His magnificence, Allahu Akbar, recognizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all-knowing with everything that we do. وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ لَهُم مَغْفِرَةٌ وَأَجْرٌ عَظِيمٌ. For the Lord Almighty had promised those that believe, here's الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا again, and had basically done pious actions, that they would have a reward of what? Maghfirah. What is al-maghfirah? Al-maghfirah is basically a sin remover. Ajr azim, a reward, a magnificent reward. What is this supposed to be saying? So this is basically telling you, in order for you, let's wipe all of that and connect it again, all right? In order for you to correct your behavior, okay? And in order for you to change with what is in your heart, and that's basically right there, this formula in where you would basically, in order to be included with those that get the maghfirah and al-ajr al-azim, this is the reward. What do they have to do? Well, this is al-iman. Al-iman consists of, one, you would connect yourself with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and al-amal al-salih would be what you would implement as qawamina lillah, what you would implement in terms of your relationship, your commitment, your consistency with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A lot to say, right? Are we absorbing it here? I'm just looking at the page and there's so much to say. I'm just trying to help you see what we're,
I was just wondering if you could explain that satisfaction part of it a little bit in more detail.
Right. Fair. So when we're speaking about al-iffa or satisfaction, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually given us a certain amount of what is considered halal. That's the area of mubah. The area of mubah or halal, all right, you could see that there is, let's just say cookies. I've got a whole, I guess, a whole bag of cookies, all right. Satisfaction, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala regarded those cookies are halal. Satisfaction would be, I take one, all right. That's satisfaction. It's basically to limit yourself with the amount. And that's the minimum amount, all right? That's the satisfaction, even though it might be in abundance, but you're limiting yourself to, one, to what is halal, two, and even when it comes to halal, you're limiting the amount because you're here not wanting to enhance your connection with dunya, but you want to basically enhance your connection with akhirah. So you're basically not only taking what is halal, but you're limiting even halal to be within a limited amount in order to make sure that you're not affecting your heart. And we're not here talking about cardiovascular diseases. We're talking about connecting with your heart, meaning alimun bidat as-sudur, in where how you would stay. Yes, even though you recognize the ni'mah, but you want to make sure that you don't overdo at least engaging in taking more of dunya and perhaps probably without you realizing, losing your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because you're feeding the body, you're overfeeding the body.
Oh, okay. Jazakallah khair.
وإياكم. So what I'll do, I'll end up inshallah with this ayah for today. وعد الله الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لهم مغفرة وأجر عظيم. يا سلام, nothing more beautiful. يا ربي, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala يرزقنا and يرزقكم يا ربي and ربي يحفظكم inshallah. Tomorrow we'll basically continue with Tafsir al-Qurtubi in this regards. Inshallah, won't be much, but inshallah we'll continue despite it because this is extremely interesting and we'll definitely, inshallah, be starting a new page. This is it. Here we go. And assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam.